And welcome to this month's Fireside Chat. My name is Irwin Oostindie, and I have the good fortune of having Chantelle Spicer with us tonight around the fireside, nice and toasty, to spend some time talking about issues that are important to us, but to have a little bit more time to break them down. And for folks who have been following our YouTube channel, you may have seen a video with Chantelle Spicer and Dennis Thomas from Tsleil-Waututh talking about co-management issues and land issues and decolonization issues. So it's a special treat to have Chantelle back for an extended conversation and to kind of expand the conversation away from issues of specifically co-management of lands, but to unpack a few issues around decolonization, of conservation, and related subjects. Welcome, Chantelle. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be back again. I wish that I was by an actual fireside right now.
Well, we're gonna, it's the COVID, pretend COVID era fires. Now, just to be transparent, and we'll talk about it later in the session, but you are also doing some really exciting work for the Wild Bird Trust of British Columbia. And that is supporting our education program, specifically around a decolonization reading group. So I just want to give people the heads up on that. We're going to talk about, well, specifically around settlers learning and doing consciousness raising and the role of consciousness raising in settlers sort of unpacking our biases. And I'm a Dutch settler. I'm also the president of the Wild Bird Trust of BC, and I have the good fortune of supporting the board of directors. I'm also a staff member in the planning at Maplewood Flats, which is a site that the Wild Bird Trust of BC has the honor of supporting, which is the unceded Tsleil-Waututh Nation lands. That's a little bit about me. Chantelle, I know you just are set to do some pomp and circumstance at Simon Fraser University and get acknowledged for your hard work and your research work, specifically working with Snuneymuxw First Nation. And we had that as a subject last time, but maybe just give our viewers a little introduction to yourself.
Yeah, that would be great. Always a good place to start. So good evening. My name is Chantelle Spicer. My mother is Hallie Spicer, nee Haddad Banks. So on my mother's side, I am Jewish, Moroccan, and Austrian. And my father is Alan Spicer, and he was adopted by Maurice and Mabel Spicer in what is now Nova Scotia. And my dad was part of a Mi'kmaq community, though because of insidious colonial policies, particularly around the 60s scoop and the stealing of Indigenous children, both myself and my father grew up outside of community. So a lot of what I've learned about my own indigeneity is actually a gift from many Coast Salish peoples, particularly, as you said, Snuneymuxw First Nation, as well as the people of Cowichan, and some really generous Métis and Maliseet women as well, who have gifted me with many teachings through our friendships and daily life. And yeah, like you said, I am just about to formally graduate from the master's program at Simon Fraser University in anthropology. And I did my thesis collaboratively with Snuneymuxw First Nation in their territory, specifically Saysutshun or Newcastle Island Provincial Marine Park. And before that, I was educated through my bachelor's degree through Vancouver Island University on Snuneymuxw territory as well. And I graduated there with a double major in anthropology and First Nation studies. And then I also have a diploma in forestry as well. So kind of what I like to consider the trifecta of awesomeness. But yeah, that's kind of just a wee snapshot about me. I wear many other hats and do many other things. I'm an embroiderer, a gardener, taker of long walks. So yeah, many of those things.
You mentioned this trifecta, and you also mentioned about the knowledge holders that supported you in your learning path. Just tell us a little bit about the thesis topic that the Ivory Tower has acknowledged, and maybe help us also understand how challenging or easy or what that's like working both for this goal of institutional acknowledgement of this knowledge that you're carrying forward, but then also choosing to do that together with members of the Snuneymuxw community?
Yeah. Yeah. That's quite a story. That could
you
be,
have half an hour for that.
yeah, that could be a session unto itself, I feel. So I came to Simon Fraser University to the master's program that I did with the like teachings and instructions of Snuneymuxw firmly rooted behind me. I'd been planning on doing the master's program for about a year in advance. So I'd been talking specifics of what that project might look like, what was needed, what the community needed, carrying into that master's program many relationships that I'd had with Snuneymuxw elders and peoples for years before that. So I came in with a pretty solid direction of what I had intended to do.
So let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you. So were you doing the subject of your research already before you decided to focus through a thesis?
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I had wanted to do, okay, so silly me. I'd wanted to do a master's thesis because I'd been doing my undergrad for about 7 years. And then having been a career student for so long, I really didn't know what I was supposed to do afterwards. So I kind of just decided to do a master's program. And it was really funny because one of the women who wrote my reference letter for the SFU master's program, when I had asked her if she would be a referee for me, she'd actually said, you really shouldn't do this. I know you as a person over the last 7 years, and I know that that is not the direction that you could go. And I said, thank you very much for the advice. I would love a reference letter from you, which she wrote, which I'm really grateful for, but I've since told her many times that she was very right. But yes, I did come into it having already had, not doing a lot of research per se, in the way that it might be imagined in academia, not having read the canon of co-management or anything like that, but having read a lot of Leanne Simpson and talking with a lot of elders and spending a lot of time with the land, that land in particular, before I did my master's program, for years and years before that.
And so was she saying, because she respected your work and thought, based on her experience, that a university path wasn't necessary for the work that you were doing, or it was a barrier? Or do you know from the takeaway now looking back, do you regret the decision, or are you proud of the decision? Are you still unresolved on that question?
I'm still a bit unresolved on that question. I mean, I think in terms of her advice, what she was talking to directly was the fact that all of my work comes very strongly from communities that I'm working with, and my heart work is really in working with community. But in academia, particularly in graduate studies, there's this big focus on the self that can be very isolating. I would be a thesis is, writing 75 to 100 pages, by yourself, claiming again and again and again, this is how I assert this. So really, and also how that work is very time consuming, especially for me. I'm a very slow processor, very slow writer. And that while you're doing that, it's really pulling you away from community work. Which even in my very first day of real grad school classes, I'd asked my professor at the time, what do you I really don't know what I'm doing here. What would you suggest is some tips for just being good at grad school and being able to do this in a good way? And she said, just focus on your thesis. Literally, you're going to be asked to do a number of things, be involved in a number of clubs or the union or whatever it is that is going to call to you. And you just have to say no. And you promptly, I'm just going to do my thesis.
Promptly ignored her advice?
I promptly ignored her advice. Yeah, definitely. I can't not. I really, I really can't not. So yeah, that's I think the advice that she was really speaking to, which she was very right about. And I have to say that like the community work that I became involved in, like through SFU and through like organizing that I was doing in Vancouver, and community making that I was doing in Vancouver, it probably did slow my thesis down. Like I probably could have been done like sometime like early summer. But I mean, I still got it done like in time. And I feel like my thesis and my life like were only improved by continuing to be involved in the things that I was involved in. So
I know your thoughts are resonating with folks, and I know for folks who watch this on YouTube, it'll also be resonating for students. But for people who aren't students or aren't familiar with scholarship or academia, what is anthropology, and why was anthropology the path for you to do this work with Snuneymuxw? Or what might, and a rim around that would be what might have been some other paths?
Yeah, so I mean, the way that I usually just like very succinctly describe anthropology to people is it's kind of the study of culture in all places and in all times. So it can have like, there are anthropologists who study, you know, like historical communities, or, you know, like archaeology sometimes falls under the discipline of anthropology. So you're studying like people way back to like the beginnings of people. And then there are also anthropologists who study like futurisms, like how do different peoples imagine the future? Like, what does that look like for them? So it really does cover an incredibly wide spectrum, just of how people relate to space and place and time and each other. So that's kind of like a gist of anthropology. So that can go a lot of different ways. Like you might see anthropology show up as like international studies or interdisciplinary studies or cultural studies. So there's a lot of different branches or names that like a similar kind of study has taken over time. But yeah, so the way that I looked at my thesis in this project with Snuneymuxw and Saysutshun was really trying to understand from multiple levels how it was that they were related and continue to be related to this landscape, and particularly the way that different colonial policies or regimes kind of like intersect or try to disrupt or hinder aspects of that relationship. So looking at, you know, like the BC Parks Act, looking at like documents surrounding the co-management agreement, park operator agreements, memorandums of understanding, agreement in principle, like those kinds of things. And reading those, like reading the way that the colonial government kind of constructs these ideas, but then spending most of my time with Saysutshun itself, and then also talking with folks who interact with those different documents, you know, the folks who steward Saysutshun on behalf of Snuneymuxw, and how those things play out or not, because like some of those things, like they really don't think about them at all. So that was also a really interesting part of that. So kind of thinking about like how do Snuneymuxw people, like through their culture, how does that culture intersect with the policies and arrangements that the government makes. So yeah.
So perhaps you could have done a pathway through maybe public policy. You could have done a master's in public policy, or
Yep.
First Nations studies, or
Yep.
what it might be some other ones. So because in some way I'm guessing you bring an interdisciplinary approach, because you're looking, I mean, and anthropology is really interdisciplinary, and anthropology has a kind of correct me if I'm wrong, it only more recently has it become more critical. It often was this kind of bastion of white male lens on the world. And there's that expression about leaving the porch, I guess, to kind of go and discover. And I'm just curious your thoughts on, do you feel like anthropology as a tool to understand, because you're not Snuneymuxw, do you feel good about the tools that it gave you and the kind of requirements of kind of proving that you knew those tools, the authority to be an expert on the case, on the story, that was the good path forward? And what about this question of, did you trip up leaving the porch to be quote unquote with the people, the subjects of your research? And was there pushback from Simon Fraser University?
Okay, that's lots of questions. So I mean, I think the tools that I acquired from my First Nation studies degree at VIU definitely gave me more tools to do this work in a good way. I think that anthropology has a lot of tools. And I mean, especially as you have noted, like there have been a lot of changes in anthropology, particularly over the last like 15, 20 years with like more creative approaches and outlooks, and even like products that you can make with anthropology. Like lots of, I mean, ethnographic video, like ethnographic documentaries have really become like a huge thing over the last few years. But
Ethnography is the study of people?
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, many terms. But I don't think that I would have been able to apply those tools in a way that would have actually been useful to Snuneymuxw and the stories that they were telling me without having that grounding in that I received through my First Nation Studies program. And I got to say, like, that is, I worry honestly that is probably like the best time that I will ever have in my life was with my cohort in First Nation Studies. Like, it was just such a space that was created for interrogating some really difficult things, like in a community that was incredibly supportive and generous, that I have not seen in any other places in academia. Honestly, I feel so lucky. And yeah, I really feel that without that and with the community that I built through my undergrad, like my project would not have been the same through my master's degree or through anthropology. So like it really gets into like, it's not just the tools you use, it's how you use them, and with what intent. So that's the first part. I would say that it was, my graduate program was very difficult. Like in one of my courses, I had a professor who was like pretty bound to the idea that Indigenous people were a topic and not people who even conducted anthropology themselves, or were knowledge carriers in the work. Like they were a topic to be studied. So yeah, that was definitely a thing that I encountered. During the course of writing my thesis, I definitely had like pushback on the ways that I was trying to tell the stories that I was hearing, a lot of questioning of like the expertise of the people who were sharing with me, like folks asking, where did they get this information from? And like really challenging those things, or, asking me, do you think this person is lying to you? And I'm like, this is a person that I've known for like nearly 10 years. And this is not the first time that they have talked in this way. So yeah, definitely a lot of like insidious racism, I would say, both for me and the people who were like so generously sharing with me. So yeah, I definitely really had to, like, with one of my committee members who's also Indigenous, is Newcastle, really like trying to make strategies for overcoming these kind of like insidious forms of racism, especially in a discipline that considers itself, like pretty progressive. It can be really hard to challenge these like insidious but also overt forms of racism, to call that out to the surface. So yeah, I mean, I know that I definitely don't have it as bad as some students at SFU, but I definitely experienced a lot of the various things that do come up in the course of this kind of study.
And I imagine some of that is people's bias, privileges. in their, or the economy of the university, or the kind of conventions of the university. But I'm especially curious for tonight's talk to think about the biases that are not just kind of like neoliberal universities, or kind of those, the hegemony of, you know, getting your thesis and then, you know, kick you out and get another student in there paying fees. But I'm thinking more about, like, you talked about geography having its day of reckoning 15, 20 years ago. That's obviously an ongoing process. But society in general, when we think about the topic that you researched of that site, and you explored various issues around how people understand the site, how they use the site historically, now, the different types of people who use the site, and the kind of impacts that those people had, intentionally or unintentionally, on Snuneymuxw's own land use. So I'm just curious if we can talk about that and what you've learned either at the university or reflecting on society in general, because I know you're also passionate about the broader issues of decolonization. If you can share a little bit about what you've learned, maybe in the time period from when you were in First Nation Studies to now you're going to be receiving your acknowledgement, your paperwork from the university. What are you feeling? There's shifts in society. We've gone through a whole cycle of quote unquote reconciliation, albeit Justin Trudeau was surfing in Tofino, you know, but I'm just curious if you're, as an opening comment, how do you feel about this journey of settler society, you know, coming to terms with these this denial that is so very functional and purposeful in the community that was using that site, that Snuneymuxw First Nation, you know, wanted to obviously self-determine its use. So can you talk about those biases and those filters and those that system of denial that you feel is shifting or is steadfast?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely very complex. So I can definitely talk about this from like this very place specific lens that I have, because each place and like each community and its visitors like interact with it very, very differently. So I can talk about it from just like this lens of truth that I have. So with Saysutshun, so since, you know, the 1850s, Saysutshun has kind of gone through like various phases of industrialization and commodification of that landscape. You know, it started with coal mining and then sandstone quarrying, and then became a place of recreation for middle class and upper class white folks. When CP Rail bought the island from the coal miners or the coal mine company, not the miners, of course, in the 1930s. And then through, you know, like the interwar period, and then even till shortly after World War II, it was a site of, you know, like pretty splendid recreation. The pavilion, a pavilion was built for dance hall, that kind of thing. But during all of that time, it obviously continued to be Snuneymuxw territory. And Snuneymuxw territory is, you know, Snuneymuxw people are still very present on that territory. There are numerous shell middens. There are, you know, culturally modified trees, you know, cedar stripped, bark stripped trees. There are, you know, longhouse posts. It has literally, like, their villages have literally shaped the landscape that continues to persist there today. So they're still very much there, but it still continues to, you know, primarily be, I think, in the view of many people, to be a site of, you know, recreation. It is, of course, like still trapped in the BC park system. And although it is co-managed, that co-management agreement is, you know, thoroughly like held and centered around colonial ideas of land and management and what a park is. And I think that in terms of biases, it's definitely complicated. Like through the co-management agreement, Snuneymuxw have definitely been increasingly present. You know, all of the branding for Saysutshun is all with the Snuneymuxw logo, like the nation's logo. Most of the people who work on the island are Snuneymuxw people, and identify themselves to visitors, very strongly as Snuneymuxw people. There are members of the community who run cultural tours. There are a number of like welcome posts that have been constructed. And of course, signage. There's increasingly more signage. And I think my perception is, because again, like my research was looking specifically at, thank you. My research was looking specifically at the co-management agreement and not so much on like how visitors perceived it. But like I said, I did spend a lot of my time just like with the island by myself. And it continues to be a place where mostly white folks go to, walk the trails, have a picnic, and have a nice swim. Like there's not a lot of thought still about, this being Snuneymuxw territory and what that means to be a guest there. And definitely quite a few Snuneymuxw people that I spoke to during my thesis, like pointed directly to that, like they're there like for the last 20 years, like strongly fighting specifically for this piece of land to be, Celeste, to be recognized as part of their territory, and for them to receive this land back from the park system, to repatriate it out of the park system.
And so we're looking at this is the proximity to the municipality of Nanaimo.
Yeah. So that's Nanaimo, like just that bit of cityscape there. Like you can easily like swim. There's been like talk about building a bridge. It's a very, very short distance between the city of Nanaimo and Saysutshun.
So in many ways for Maplewood Flats, there's some parallels, both its proximity to an ongoing use by the First Nation, but also kind of quote unquote human stressors, these kind of colonial stressors and colonial histories of entitlement.
Yeah, like in the bit of the Salish Sea between the two, it's like the Nanaimo Yacht Club, so it's this really interesting juxtaposition for sure, especially when you're walking trails along the western side, and you're in this beautiful like arbutus grove. Like arbutus is just like bending out over the side of the island to get the sun, and this like old growth forest that's regrowing through the Douglas fir forest, and it's just stunning. And then through the trees you can see Nanaimo like very clearly, like you could reach out and touch it, and it's very present in the soundscape. So it's quite interesting.
And were you one of the first people to do some rigorous academic work, or is there a history of journalists and critical writers or community members who have used writing or journalism or research to kind of unsettle this colonial occupation?
I mean, there's definitely like a body of research about it for sure, that exists in the Nanaimo archives, that exists. There was a gentleman, I forget his name. There was a settler author who did do quite a bit of research about the industrial history and like the recreational history of Saysutshun. The section on Snuneymuxw is a page and a half long, out of the entire book. And then there have been some like documented ghost stories about Saysutshun. So there's been bits and pieces. And definitely, like the people of Snuneymuxw have written about this island in various forms, but I'd say that mine like might be one of the first like big critical academic investigations into this landscape, but it has been touched on in like other pieces of academia for sure. Before we get too far away from the biases question though, I do want to point out this like this interesting thing that came up in some other work that I had done in my undergrad, which was with Milner Gardens in Qualicum Beach on Vancouver Island as well, which was all about, how you include Indigenous knowledges into this incredibly like colonial garden space. that like really celebrates colonialism. And what I found in talking with visitors there, and what I see echoed in Saysutshun, and I'm sure that other people see echoed in other places, is this kind of like settler curiosity, like kind of, you know, like the curio idea of what it means for that to be Indigenous land, and for there to be, you know, like archaeology in particular, has this like curiosity aspect to it. And I think that we see that show up in a lot of different spaces where you have, you know, like settlers who are trying to, you know, learn more about Indigenous histories, is this curiosity. And when I was talking with Elliot Kwasselton Whitehill, is for there to be, you know, like a real like investigation and shifting of these biases towards any kind of like decolonization, is that it's good to come into these relationships and like these ideas like with a genuine sense of curiosity. That's actually really important, but it can't just stop there. Like you can't just be like curious enough to learn like the surface level things and then carry on with your day. That it really has to be like a curiosity that's not just about, you know, like the history, or I wonder what it would be like, but a curiosity that also is interested in unsettling the way that things have been. Like that's a good place to start, but it can't be the stopping place, which often it is. And that's really where we see a lot of issues come up, you know, with like signage, is it really fulfills this issue of like curiosity without allowing us to go deeper, or even asking us to go deeper. It's not asking us to be critical about what that actually means to us. So that was something that Elliot had pointed out, and I just wanted to bring that into this space while we're talking about biases.
Yeah, and is it fair to say that denial is a key function, and that denial plays an important role, that because it's denial is not actually talked about, because we can describe it as biases, and there's many biases, but there's some fundamental biases that are about that benefit settlers,
Yeah.
economically, cultural identity. And I'm curious your thoughts on what you've learned about denial, whether it's through discussion with settlers, or whether you know may have been a discussion with an academic or a professor or a particular person that you wanted to kind of provoke to understand where those biases came from. And were you aware of denial as a function, and can you speak to that role? I would argue that genocide requires denial to function, and it's because we have such a hard time as Canadians, quote unquote, to acknowledge genocide. I think there's an operational requirement for us to have, for settler culture to have denial in its cultural biases, in its toolkit. So what have you learned about that, and do you see denial as a kind of a pillar of the problem that we have to untackle, to address your comment about that decolonization requires some groundwork before it actually can get done?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we were speaking a bit about this on Thursday when we had the reading group that you alluded to. Is there are a lot of people who are like in early stages of learning about this, and I know, like, I have been in early stages of learning about this too, and that is like our denial is actually a product of, you know, the way it is that we're educated. You know, like when we don't know something, it is a purposeful marginalization or silencing, especially when we're speaking, you know, about genocide and oppression and violence perpetrated by the state. I think perhaps a useful way of framing it, and maybe it's not speaking, you know, directly to this aspect of denial, but I think speaks very directly to the groundwork that has to be done as we enter into, you know, decolonization work, is I've heard a lot of Indigenous people and residential school survivors and, you know, survivors of sexualized and gender-based violence talk about the harms that are carried by people who violence is perpetrated against, but also the like denial of humanity that the people who perpetrate that harm carry. And I think that there's a lot of, like complicit oppression that is perpetrated by lots of settlers. And that, has been perpetrated like by Indigenous people through lateral violence as well. We really have to do a lot of like that healing work, which includes recognizing the places that we might have carried denial, or where we might have been complicit in something, or where we've been shown something or taught something and like refused to believe it as true in that moment. Like that's also a very particular form of denial. And like doing that healing work that allows us to be open to learning, that allows us to be like humble in that learning space. So yeah, I mean, I do recognize denial as a pillar of that. And I think that there's, like other Indigenous people have much more eloquently pointed to, this like need to kind of like unsettle not only that denial, but the linked pillar of like the loss of humanity that we have when we perpetrate violence and silence and allow and like really encourage denial to be a part of our society.
As an Indigenous woman, as a woman who's very familiar around consent politics and violence, and for me as a man who's on the side of the gender side of the group that does 87 or 90% of the violence against women, are you comfortable with, not necessarily me specifically, but making, if I were to make the parallel that men not addressing violence is akin to settlers not addressing genocide? And
definitely.
Yeah, and
those two are super connected to each other. Like they rely on each other for sure. That is a strong connection.
And so the as you point out, the kind of harm that is done, and we certainly know the harm and the suicide rates of men, and we know the kind of social conditioning that men suffer from, and the denial of culpability, the denial of responsibility, the denial of accountability. That's I think there's some huge opportunities for us as public educators to kind of show. But I'm curious your thoughts on the politics of using this argument. When men talk about where's the men's shelters, or why can't I go to a women's shelter, or my first thought is like, hey guys, like women built all of this infrastructure because women did the repair because their sisters were harmed, and it wasn't men who built those shelters, and it's not women, it's not men who staff the hotlines for the most part. And so I think there's akin to this notion of addressing decolonization, if it's Indigenous people whose labor is required to kind of shake the settler cities and say, hey folks, like we want justice, is that not also an important parallel to be made in terms of who's actually doing the labor?
Yeah, definitely. To the first point about like the politics of making that connection between, violence against Indigenous women and colonialism and the stealing of land, is that Indigenous women have been saying that all along. That, a lot of the time in like resistance movements, Indigenous led resistance movements, you hear the phrase like violence on the land is violence on our bodies. And that is not a metaphor at all. And is definitely, a correlation that is made all the time and has been for decades and decades. So I think, picking up this idea and reality is a really important part of the conversation for sure, to ending violence against both women and land. And of course, Two-Spirit and trans peoples as well. And then, sorry, what was the second part of the question?
How, based on the fact that you have considerable experience as an educator, men can be defensive around their accountability, their culpability. even though we benefit so much. And it's like, hey guys, you know, you think there's a correlation between the fact that we don't show up and the fact that we have a lot of privilege from not showing up. So settlers looking at land in their own neighborhoods, the fact that settlers accrue immense, not all settlers, but many settlers accrue immense wealth just through 1 or 2 generations of privilege, accessing accrued land increases in accrued land value. So through 2-3 generations, middle-class families in Nanaimo or in Vancouver, North Vancouver, can become millionaires while and somehow that's culturally accepted because of this kind of capitalist society that we live in. But for folks who are not in that marketplace, that privileged landowner class, there is that inequity, and that inequity is structural, and that poverty that Indigenous peoples in our own communities, because let's acknowledge that we're talking about, for example, Snuneymuxw and Tsleil-Waututh or around Vancouver, Musqueam and Squamish. These are fairly urbanized populations whose houses and streets lead on to other houses and streets, and then suddenly these people are millionaires, and there's a struggle for economic equity and justice just on those reasons. So that, I think it's an important thing, but I was curious your thoughts on that educating, and that, you know, we're in this reconciliation moment. We want to go into a decolonization moment. We want to go into a redress moment where land back is actually on the table. But there's these biases, there's these barriers, there's this lack of acknowledgement that there actually is a problem because settlers benefit so much.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there's much more to say than that, Irwin. Like, you laid that out definitely pretty clearly, and in a very real way. You know, like going back to even talking about, like, you know, those biases in the way that visitors to Saysutshun, you know, experience, you know, a really nice day for swimming on Snuneymuxw territory, is, you know, with the realization that Snuneymuxw people, like, their nation is literally paying for them to be able to do that, and experiencing, you know, like many people in the nation experiencing incredible, like, devastating poverty, like devastating, like, to my heart, that they should have to live in a way while there are white people, like, literally paying nothing to swim on their territory. So yeah, that's definitely a reality. How it is that we, you know, like, educate and raise consciousness, and then, like, move beyond raising consciousness to, like, actual action towards land back, is so unique to each area, and to each person. Like, it's really hard, honestly, to hold the simultaneous ideas of how urgently we need for decolonization and land back to happen, while also holding, you know, the pedagogical idea that I have, where, like, people need to be able to, like, learn how to move forward in a good way, in, like, a safe space, like, at the pace that they're going to learn that. So it's honestly incredibly difficult to know how to navigate the present, leading towards, you know, like building right now the future that we want to live in. Because there is this urgency to move incredibly quickly to end, like, the violence and oppression that Indigenous people are having, but it can't be done in a way that, like, isn't done with a good heart. So yeah, it's honestly very, very tricky.
And you talk about place-based. Maybe we can go in there, and we have a few more minutes, and before we want to open it up for questions. Place-based, I'm certainly familiar with it. I'm passionate about it, and I know you are. But maybe we can just kind of help the viewers understand a little bit more about what it means. And maybe there's a couple of other words that I might throw in, like pan-nativism. There's issues around how settlers might view Indigenous people as sort of a mass of Indigenous Canadians. And so when you talk about place-based, you know, a lot of us are here because of the Wild Bird Trust's caretaking Maplewood Flats, a particular area of Burrard Inlet in Vancouver's Inner Harbor. That's a
Mhm.
particular place that has particular industrialized heritage. It has, but its commonality with Snuneymuxw is that it's been colonized and it's been removed from the core jurisdiction of the local First Nation. So when we think about place-based, not to deep dive further into Snuneymuxw or Saysutshun or Maplewood Flats, but the importance, your comments on the importance of a place-based. What are some more examples of the benefits, and how is being place-based? Is that like think globally, act locally? Is it about like taking principles and then applying them to where you're standing on your feet? What for you is the benefit of place-based, and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that your connection to like bringing up the pan nativism is actually really important when we talk about place-based work, for sure, because it directly undermines pan nativism. This idea that like you say, like all Indigenous people are the same everywhere. And it's really true that like a lot of Indigenous communities share similar values or ideas about the landscape, but how those relationships play out and what exactly those relationships are rooted in, you know, what's your creation story? Those kinds of things are really unique to each community and each nation, and really shape the way that particular landscape is known. And I mean, as settlers, you know, like settlers also create place-based relationships with all the places that they engage with as well, but they don't come from those super deep roots. Like settlers don't have creation stories here in the same way. You know, there's the facade of the creation of Canada, but you know, we settler peoples just don't have the creation stories here that Indigenous peoples do. And I guess in terms of like benefits of place-based knowledge, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's a bit, it's definitely complicated, especially when we, you know, you think about like the right to migrate, which I think that as birders would be a concept that's really, really well understood, you know, thinking about like the act locally, think globally, or whatever that saying is, oh, this is complicated. I'm making this complicated. Is just as we move about the world, wherever it may be, is being in a good relationship to that place, and the peoples that are there. You know, when birds migrate or live in a certain place, they make relationships and live in an economy and structure that they fit in and that they understand. You know, birds don't go somewhere and then just like if birds went somewhere without recognizing the values of that place and the economies that exist in that place, they would die. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's really coming into the places that we know or that we are in relationship in that moment, very humbly, and forming relationships that are reciprocal in very deep ways. The benefits of place-based knowledge is literally survival. Like the knowledge that allows us to keep living in the places that we live, or visit. But I think that there's also, you know, this like spiritual level of place-based knowledge that can't be forgotten about either. I think that we've all experienced, you know, being with a trail or waterside or place and like feeling that you're home and safe in that place, no matter where that might be and how fulfilling that is. You know, like speaking about place-based spaces, is like also recognizing that our bodies are our space, and really understanding the connections between our bodies and our heart and our spirits and places as well. So I think that there's just like such a a spectrum of benefits that come to knowing a place and all of the ways that it can be known. That was a very convoluted answer. Sorry.
When we think about learning about decolonization, then in a place-based context, what role do you think, you mentioned some of the people who've inspired you, and some of those was place-based knowledge that helped you understand the place that you were in. But sometimes, if you think about Leanne Simpson or other folks, there's writers that may not be from coastal Salish lands that can still inform our lenses and help us adapt to pick up tools that might be place-based. So I guess maybe for a closing question, your thoughts on the learning, the consciousness raising path, the tools that we can equip ourselves with to do better place-based work. Not necessarily, as all being anthropologists doing master's degrees and 5 years of research on a site, but maybe it's work that we're doing with other colleagues. Maybe it's a project that we're going to be doing, or maybe it's learning about our church lands, the history of our church lands, or where we work, or Union Hall. So whatever it is for people, it'll all be different, unique to their path. But what might be some toolkits, some tools in the toolkit that we can walk forward with as we sort of investigate that these places that we occupy? As particular, I'm speaking, I guess, about settlers. It's applicable to everybody, of course, but I'm specifically thinking about consciousness raising by settlers to apply place-based tools where they're living and working and growing as humans. In relation to, I loved your example, in relation to these bird families these bird relations that are also sharing the space.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to be clear that the world definitely does not need more anthropology graduate students. I want to be super clear about that. I shouldn't have even been one, honestly. So yeah, the tools that I want to provide folks with are not things that I learned in a master's program, and they can be applied in definitely any part of your life. I think, I mean, in my presentation that I did for the general meeting for Wild Bird Trust, I think one of the quotes that I brought up was from Joan Brown, who is a Snuneymuxw woman, who, when I asked her what I should do with Saysutshun for my thesis, is she actually asked me the question is, how do we come before a place that is so sacred in a good way? And that really led the way that I engaged with Saysutshun in particular, but has now, framed the way that I step on all the land that I walk with. How am I conducting myself right now in a way that acknowledges that this is sacred land to somebody, but also inherently unto itself. With every step that I take, it's on stolen land. That in the course of my living here, I've actually been welcomed to by many host nations. So how am I acting as a good guest with this step? And it can show up in really practical parts of my life. Like when I'm walking to the grocery store, it's not just like being on autopilot, listening to my headphones. It's being aware of, what birds are around me. What are the plants doing right now? What does the wind feel like right now? What does my body feel like right now? And really taking myself off autopilot to be aware of how I am in that space at that time. So that is actually it's really changed the way that I move through space. So that's on a very personal level. But I guess in terms of how we raise consciousness collectively, I think that there's some pieces of that we can carry into that space as well. How do you come into your learning? Do you come into your learning to challenge? Are you listening to challenge, or are you listening to listen? Is one way that a Croatan elder had framed it to me. which really knocks you out of your academic like debate style. Let me tell you, I don't know if I've ever really engaged in academic discussion the same ever since. And it, you know, it really asks you to move when you're thinking about that humble learning. It really asks you to move beyond that curiosity that I was talking about later. You know, like when you're humbly learning, you're not seeking to fulfill any kind of curiosity. You're really like opening yourself up to learn what needs to be learned in that moment. And it also speaks to, I do want to mention before moving on to the next point, this idea of like hungry listening. I forget who the author is. I can look it up really quick. But he's an Indigenous man, I'll look him up, who talks about, you know, like the hungry listening of settlers, speaking to this notion of, you know, like a lot of settler culture being like really empty and looking like people looking to like fill that emptiness with like Indigenous curiosity. And, you know, we saw that come out of a lot of the like 1970s, like new age / environmentalist realm. So it's like, how do we move out of that space to, you know, like listen in a way that we're not just seeking to fill ourselves with someone else's culture and knowledge, but seeking to unsettle. Thank you very much, Irwin. You're always so good at that. Seeking to
their friend Bracken's artwork.
Great, awesome, perfect. So yeah, like really seeking to unsettle the things that that we might have internalized. And I think, you know, kind of another really important thing to touch on when we're talking about the way that we learn decolonization is something that you alluded to earlier, Irwin, is the labor that Indigenous people have already invested into reconciliation or decolonization or whatever that is, and just being aware of how it is that you're asking Indigenous people to do labor. You know, just because you know an Indigenous person doesn't mean that you can like send them an email and ask them for like a reading list or ask them to like weigh in on a particular topic in that moment that, you know, might be in the news, or asking them to show up to stuff and not being ready to reciprocate in some way. So yeah, an important part of that decolonization work is not only the work that we do, you know, in ourselves and in our communities, but also how we like ask people to do labor for that learning. So yeah, that's an important part. I realize that I've probably spoken for way too long, but not said enough on this topic. I feel like I could talk on this topic for a long time.
Yeah, no, and I think it's one of the earlier comments too. These are big issues, and if folks can benefit from kind of looking behind the curtain and seeing how complex these are, they're getting a sense of some of the subjects that they can do further research on, and piques their curiosity, or it affirms some of their instincts and affirms some of their suspicions about our own, speaking for myself, speaking about our own culture, our own settler biases, or so settler conditioning. What you're doing is sort of unpacking a little bit of that and showing us some tools we can walk forward with. Should we open it up for some questions, and some of our other viewers can ask you a question. And I think for when this is uploaded to YouTube, obviously if folks can ask a question or throw up a comment on the YouTube, and eventually someone will reply to it, but it'll be nice to see the questions that come up arise from people on YouTube. But for now, let's see if some of our audience also has a question for you.
Or a comment. It doesn't even have to be a question.
I know there's some other folks who've done research and also have their thoughts on the kind of challenges of academia and the constraints there. So that's a lovely subject, or consciousness raising, place-based actions that people are making in their own neighborhoods and their own lives. Any of these are great topics for people to jump in here.
Hi, Leanne here. Yeah, I mean, you guys have really covered a lot of the ground, so it's been really helpful to contextualize things and hear more from Chantelle about your own path. And what's interesting about the work at Maplewood Flats at Tsleil-Waututh is the other players that we have to contend with, each, as you mentioned, around the different contexts. So like the Port of Vancouver and the District of North Vancouver and Environment Canada and these others that sort of lay claim to the site and have different jurisdictions and politics. And so and I saw a bit that Snuneymuxw has the Nanaimo Port Authority that they're creating an agreement with. So it's just interesting to see these overlaps and having to contend with these other governing bodies. So just I just think about that in terms of how we have to create these plans, and that's why things like agreements, relationship agreements, and that between, in our case, Wildbird Trust and Tsleil-Waututh will be really critical in having in articulating, being able to articulate how we're working in alliance in the context of these other parties. And so just interested if there's any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship between Snuneymuxw and the Port Authority in Nanaimo is complicated, to put it the most nicely that I can. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that many Indigenous peoples who have territory that includes, the water, would definitely recognize the complications that come with these capitalist driven, like very industrial driven authorities, like literally it's in their name. When Indigenous peoples, have not only Aboriginal title, rights and title, but also, have been in relationship with that. And that relationship has its own unique authority, though I wouldn't exactly frame it like that. In terms of building those relationship agreements or those relationships, one thing that Snuneymuxw people talked about a lot, and I mean, I'd be happy to send the link to for my thesis with, I can highlight the parts that speak specifically about, like the creation of those agreements and the way that they've played out, is just the lack of Snuneymuxw perspectives and relationships and culture in those agreements. They're incredibly colonially centered. Like, it's only in the newer documents that Snuneymuxw have made themselves that you see those relationships and that like recognition of the territory really come through. Elder Geraldine Manson, Auntie Geraldine, who was such a huge contributor to my thesis, when she was talking about the creation of the park operator agreement and the memorandum of understanding that then became the co-management agreement, is that if Snuneymuxw would have made that, it wouldn't have been a piece of paper, it would have been a song. And it would have had, like a story that when you enact that relationship, like that story or that song is like put into that space rather than having it as a document. Having seen the inside of the Snuneymuxw and petroglyph offices, a number of times, it's like there's all of these relationships that exist in binders. It's just like rooms and rooms full of binders that hold all of these agreements, and you have to wonder, like, what is that relationship when it's like locked away in a binder that like you have to struggle to find, like you might open once a year to update it as required. So yeah, I think that as we think about, decolonizing and making these relationship agreements, it's like, what is the practice of making relationships and having, protocols, even though that's a very colonial word, that the Indigenous people that you're working with would have had, and how can you echo that and like really model that in the relationships that you're building now?
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
There's a question from Tara. Do you want to, the question is one that's apropos for tonight. I don't know if Tara, you want to unmute yourself? Speaking about your thesis work, which we've linked in the chat, and with your permission, we'll link to the YouTube channel as well.
Hi, thank you very much, Chantelle and Irwin, for this talk. And I apologize, I missed the first 10 minutes, so you might have covered a little bit of this, and I'm excited to read your thesis and learn more. But I wondered, from your perspective and through your thesis work, did you come to any conclusions about how best BC Parks, or these type of authorities, Port Authority and settlers, could work together with Indigenous folks? You spoke a little bit about that on Leanne's question, but anything further you had to add, I'd be open to hearing.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you for the question. I mean, yes and no. I was actually pretty clear in my thesis that I didn't want to come to any like conclusion of best practices or recommendations in my thesis, for political reasons, but also because that's really up to Snuneymuxw to decide. And that was not like what we focused on necessarily in our conversations. But I think some of the things that really stood out for me is knowing, like, coming into those relationships or shifting your perspective in those relationships to know that Indigenous peoples know where they're going, and know how they want to get there. And really stepping back in that work and being humble and recognizing that you don't come to the table with all the answers. I think that a lot of the times these relationships or agreements or like decision-making tables, you know, a lot of folks who sit in positions, you know, with colonial institutions like parks or the Port Authority, like come into these agreements like with a very set agenda that is very colonial and with a lot of decisions having already been made. And it's really coming to it. It's really about coming to the table and seeing, putting all of that aside and seeing what Indigenous peoples are dreaming about, or they're already enacting that, like through their own governance or through their own community initiatives. You know, a lot of Indigenous communities are already doing this work, and it's a matter of figuring out how we can put aside these colonial ideas to make space for those, and real, you know, tangible empowerment behind them. And that's going to look different for, you know, like I think I've said like probably 10 times, is that it's really context based. I think for parks, I mean, like in my particular case, for BC Parks, it's really, you know, moving away from these like contract service agreement and delivery models, which is how a lot of the co-management agreements, you know, before 5 years ago were made. And there's a number of them that still exist like that. You know, there's a lot in the news right now about like new co-management agreements that are being made. And there's a lot of work being done about like in BC Parks about making new co-management agreements that are quite different. And it's really ignoring these like old relationships that have become like very stagnant and distrustful. So yeah, I mean, a lot of this work too is like realizing that it's not about check boxes. Like that speaks directly to this notion of check boxes. It's like, oh, like we've made a co-management agreement with this nation, check, and it ignores the fact that that's like a living relationship. Like it's a co-management relationship, and that requires, you know, like nourishment and growth for that to stay alive. So it's a lot, like there are a lot of very practical things that need to be done, but before those practical things can be done, you know, like these tools can be used, it's again, you know, thinking about how are we using them, and coming into that work with the right, or, you know, like not the right, but Indigenous spaces for those to be enacted.
And,
And yeah, please go ahead.
and recognizing that that it's a journey, and that that's particular different times and places and different localities. In terms of the place-based, it's not just place-based, but it's also specific that 5 years ago, today, 5 years from now, there'll be different realities and different conditions, especially as we focus on authentic reconciliation, and there's economic and cultural resurgence by coastal Salish peoples, that the terms and the negotiating positions will be quite different as we go. So to your point, being flexible and adaptable to the needs, the aspirations, the capacity, the goals of each local First Nation. Just to maybe do one final question, and then we can wrap up. And I think Paula Booker has the next question.
Hi, thanks for that fantastic, talk, and also for sharing your thesis. I'm super excited to tuck into that and see the work that you've done. So I do have a question related to Saysutshun. I was really lucky to go there for the first time this summer, and I'm that settler person who was recreating and enjoying a swim and enjoying the environment, and at the same time being incredibly uncomfortable about the relationships and the way that I saw those. That's what I understood to be a service provider relationship, and what I also understood to be a co-management agreement with Nanaimo, and having the chance to meet lots of people from the nation who were in service provider roles, who were driving the ferry, who were like working all day, and it was really challenging. Actually, it was really interesting. Also being on the Nanaimo side of the water and taking a boat chartered and owned and run by Nanaimo. But when you're there, when you're on the jetty, there is a sign, a cultural panel, if you will. Welcome to Newcastle Island. And it doesn't even say the name Saysutshun, and it is it's like it was written 100 years ago. That's how it read. It was like, it says that it was, the island was abandoned when coal mining began 100 and something years ago. It was like, I was there and I was like shocked to read this introduction to this place that I was going, which I understood to have a current reality far different to the one that was described. And so I guess I just wanted to touch on this. I know that I've kind of like talked about information panels before, but as an outsider, I am looking to find information, and as a person who wants to like be on land in a good way, and like understands that that involves understanding what the language that is spoken there, and who the people are who have relationships and responsibilities to that place. When this is not actually, so this is the BC Park sign on the Nanaimo side I'm talking about, because once you arrive at Saysutshun, you're greeted by a welcome post. There is incredible, like there's a bounty and a depth and a richness of stories and information that is willingly shared. And I was really lucky to do a cultural tour with Dave Spirit Wolf, who's like so generous, and at the same time it's such a humble guy who's like feels like like he's working so hard to share the stories of his nation, and in a way that like made me a little bit uncomfortable to be the recipient of that cultural knowledge in a way, as in a service provider situation. Anyway, it is complicated, but I want to just come back to saying like how can we kind of like work with landscape or work with kind of signage and understand, like do you think that these are useful places for this information to live? Is there like, these cultural panels or signs, or, like how can that, there's that question, but also, like how sustainable is a park operator role for the nation who actually has a territorial responsibility to this place? How sustainable is that as a model? And what's the shift? I guess this is perhaps in your thesis, and I look forward to like getting into that. I guess I'm just like, those two things, like what the hell with these panels, and second of all, how to kind of shift beyond this service provider situation to something much more recognizing the important relationships.
So the name change from Newcastle Island to Saysutshun has been done informally. Like you'll see it on like current promotional stuff is Saysutshun - Newcastle Island Provincial Marine Park. And I know that there are plans for BC Parks to formally change the name to Saysutshun, which is really exciting, and will hopefully include the removal of that old Newcastle sign, which is from the 1930s. And yeah, it just like brings joy to my heart that you did a cultural tour with Dave. He's just so patient and so generous. Just like a deeply kind and generous man that, yeah, you'll see him show up lots in my thesis when you read it. But yeah, I mean, I think that there is definitely place for signage. And I know that, so when you walk onto Saysutshun, there's like a 1920s, 30s gazebo. They used to just be like an empty gazebo that Snuneymuxw, the Petroglyph Development Group has made signage for. And I know that there's interest from parks to put more signage up. BC Parks loves signage, but it's finding this balance between, telling people about the land that they're standing on, but also asking them to be like critical while they're recreating, which is like, that's the big question, right? Is like, do people actually want to be challenged while they're just trying to go and have a good time? And for me, the answer is yes, absolutely. Like, I want to be challenged all the time. But that's not everybody. So it's like trying to find, I think that there's space for signage to be really useful, as long as it's not just like talking about historical aspects, or like not being like, it has to be critical, and it asks people to like engage with these landscapes in very thoughtful ways. There's also the conversation too, which you would see come up in my thesis that I had with Dave, about how signage also needs to be careful about what you're inviting people to know. Like even on the maps that you see of Saysutshun, it identifies some important Snuneymuxw village sites. And those aren't actually where those village sites were located, because in this current day and age, like, you have to be careful about telling settler visitors where stuff is, because of this idea of like curiosities and them like doing damage or stealing or vandalizing important places. So there's definitely that aspect of it. And I mean, the nation is eager and ready to not just be in a service provider position with that park. Like, they've been training up their people. They know the direction that they want to go in, and it is not to continue to be in a service provider role, for sure. Like, it will still have some of those elements. Like, we still need folks to drive the ferry, and we still need folks who take care of the land, but it has to be done in ways that are about relationship and stewardship, and aren't about fulfilling a service agreement.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like you said, it's about coming to the table with actually in a, like, what's the word, is to come in a good way, not have prior expectations, like saying, well, we have an opening for a park operator, and that's the only way that you can have a relationship with this land. If you want to have a relationship, this is the only way you can have any level of autonomy. It's like, well, that's not actually that's not working in good faith, actually, because in good faith means you come to the table understanding the power imbalances and dynamics, and being ready to do something different, not just repeating the same model. It just seems like it's repeating the same model that has already existed, which has been exploitative and has been so problematic. But I mean, I think having somebody like Dave as a cultural ambassador is amazing, because he will tell you stories, and he will say, this is actually a different story to the one that we printed down, because the one that we printed out about the white raccoons, that could get taken away from us, that could get carried away, and because I'm not saying it verbally, he says, I say this one verbally, it's a different story, because you're here to hear this, and please do not repeat this. This is my story I'm telling to you. And I think, that it's amazing to have that that opportunity to learn from somebody on the land. And I look forward to those relationships, being able to Nanaimo having more autonomy and ultimate responsibility for that place. So reading. Thanks for answering my question.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you're definitely on the exact track there, Paula. I mean, seriously, imagine how insulting it would be to enter into a co-management agreement and have all of these Nanaimo people working with the land, and then the parks people telling them how to be in relationship with their own land, like a land that they've stewarded and been in relationship with since time immemorial. Like, they have creation stories that are like connected between the mountains and like the water that is like that touches Saysutshun, it's just so deeply insulting. And we definitely are at a place in time where there needs to be more action towards correcting these, like very insulting mistakes of the past.
So on that note, we're going to wrap this fireside chat up with Chantelle Spicer. Chantelle, thank you so much for sharing this evening with us by the fireside, the virtual fireside. Welcome you to throw down some closing comments, but just also welcome our viewers to consider working with the Wildbird Trust in a place-based strategy that we're doing at Maplewood Flats in the unceded lands of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. Shared, of course, with Squamish and Musqueam. And we talked about this place-based, I was asking you about place-based approaches, and one of the approaches is consciousness raising, and we're grateful to have you, Chantelle, support our educational work through our decolonization reading club, and that'll continue this fall 2021, and maybe even focus a little bit more on ornithology and decolonizing birding. So lots of learning. The Nature House is also a hub for us to learn and have these conversations with Tsleil-Waututh members. So a real direct dialogue between Tsleil-Waututh and the settler organization, Wildbird Trust. And as we kind of close that gap between the Wildbird Trust and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation on this specific land with specific place-based solutions driven and directed and governed by Tsleil-Waututh. So that's enough from me, and just allow you some a closing thought if you want to throw something down, Chantelle. Otherwise, we'll bid our viewers adieu.
I mean, just a humble thanks for listening to me ramble on about something that's very near and dear to my heart. And thank you, Irwin, for trusting me to take up a bit of space that you offer through the platform of the Wildbird Trust. I feel every time like I talk that I never do justice to all of the incredible things that I learned. They're really hard to get out in certain time allotments. But yeah, just really grateful for the space and for folks being here to witness, and thank you to those who asked questions. And yeah,
Super.
It's been a great time. Good night, everybody.
We have, I'll just share the screen. We have the next event coming up, which is a photo workshop. And if people want to learn more about photography, it's a great way to skill up and have your work shown at the Nature House. So you get both the opportunity to learn about photography with two photographers, Sho and Pierre, but then also actually show your work in the Nature House. So that's coming up. And the next exhibition is photography about the site. And the next one after that will be on repairing relations. So really much at the heart of the conversation tonight about repairing relations between settlers and different relations, animal relations, and also repairing relations between the original stewards of the land, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and the current caretakers, the Wildbird Trust. So lots of work happening at the Nature House that we welcome our viewers to join us in that journey with. So thanks so much, Chantelle, and we'll see you soon.
Good night, all.
Good night.